Boker Tov, welcome, Bruchim Abayim, Rabbi Rabotai. We are continuing on Shulchan Aruch, the halachot of Shabbat, and we are starting Siman Resh Nun Bet today, the halachot of melachot mutarot v'asurot be'erev Shabbat. What things can you start or can you not start on erev Shabbat? Again, this is one example of the things that we have been studying as prohibitions that Chazal have placed on our conduct throughout Friday in order to make sure that we are available for preparation for Shabbat. It's part of Kavod Shabbat. Now, mutar להתחיל במלאכה בערב שבת סמוך לחשיכה, אף על פי שאינו יכול לגומרה מבעוד יום, והיא נגברת בעיניה בשבת. Now, sometimes you have a halachic issue with starting a work on Shabbat as well. For instance, on Shabbat you cannot water plants. You can't water plants on Shabbat, right? Because that is the Isur D'Oraita of Zriyah. So can I start the watering 2 minutes before Shabbat, 5 minutes before Shabbat? I open a hose into my garden, which is made with canals and goes through the whole garden over the course of Shabbat. So start the dripping system from before Shabbat, right? And it keeps on watering it throughout Shabbat. Is that mutar? I'm setting it up from 2 minutes before Shabbat in order that on Shabbat my garden should be fully watered, right? So the halacha is that's mutar, because I am not doing anything on Shabbat. The fact that I am setting up a system from before Shabbat is not a transgression of Shabbat by itself. Or כגון לשרות דיו וסמנים במים והם נשרים כל השבת. You want to create, like Rambam holds, making en aseva is asur d'oraita. You're soaking different species of dye inside water to create the dye, in order to paint or to dye different material on Motzei Shabbat. So you want to do this process of preparation from prior to Shabbat, right before Shabbat, is mutar. ולתת אונין של פשטן לתנור כדי שיתלבנו, ולתת סמר לתוך היורה שאינה על האש והיא פתוחה ביתית. All of that will be mutar. In other words, you're putting some wet bundles of flax inside the tanur in order for them to be processed well, or putting wool inside the pot of dye for it to absorb the dye properly over the course of Shabbat. It's not on fire, you've taken it off the fire, but it's hot and you want to put the bundles of wool inside and seal the pot and wait until Motzei Shabbat you take it out completely dyed and well. So that all is mutar. But if it's on fire, if the pot is on fire, shemi ala esh asur shema yechateh. That's a different issue of shema yechateh b'gechalim. It's a Resh Nun Gimel problem, not Resh Nun Bet. In the next Siman we're going to be discussing that. Ve'afilu eina ala esh im ena tucha betit. Or even if it's not on fire, but you have not sealed the pot with cement, basically, right? They used to either do it with tar, with cement, or with clay. Then it's asur because maybe you're going to open the top, the lid of the pot, and come to make sure that you stir the pot to equally dye all the wool that is inside. That's also, of course, asur on Shabbat. So if you seal it, then you're not concerned you're going to come to break the seal to do that. And if you have a pot also that it has non-cooked or not fully cooked food or items in it, and you stir it on Shabbat, that would also be an isur of bishul. Therefore, many people who put their cholent in their crock pot or in the pot right before Shabbat, those people should not necessarily be serving to their little kids cholent on Friday night for dinner, because in many parts of it may still not be fully cooked, and when you stir it, when you put the thing to serve, that could be an issue. So therefore, for reasons beyond the scope of this shiur right now, we'll discuss that in Shin Yud Chet, Bezrat Hashem. Many have the minhag, at least the Ashkenazim, based on Ma'aril, and others, that they don't serve food from a pot that's on fire. They're certainly not going to stir the pot. But if it's fully cooked, it should be fine, right? So that's just things that are asur on Shabbat itself. But if it's not asur on Shabbat, and you're not doing anything, you're just putting it into motion from beforehand without any concern, halachic concern, that you're going to tamper with it on Shabbat itself, it will be mutar. Umutar lifros mitzvos, therefore, it's mutar to set up traps from before Shabbat. You could be like you are a fisherman, and you are setting up right before Shabbat your nets to come Motzei Shabbat and take hundreds of fish that have been fallen to your trap. Or it could be like some people, we had this once. We had a creature in our home that was causing damage, and one Shabbat that we were off, I was speaking somewhere, we purchased this like live trap that doesn't kill them, but it catches them live. So we put it where we felt this creature was passing by every night, and sure enough, when we came Motzei Shabbat, it was trapped, and we released it somewhere, and that was it. So that probably was caught on Shabbat, because we left, shortly before Shabbat, and it was there right after Shabbat. Even though the trap works on Shabbat, that's not a problem. You could have mesudot chaya ve'ofot ve'dagim ve'hem nisodim b'Shabbat. You could have them trapped on Shabbat, so long as you have set up the traps all from before Shabbat. Umutar, says the Shulchan Aruch, it is allowed למכור לאינו יהודי ולחטאינו סמוך לחשיכה ובלבד שיצא מפתח ביתו מבעודיו. We have discussed this already before, that you could sell something to a goy before Shabbat, and put it on his shoulders to take it out, so long as he leaves your domain before Shabbat. V'yesh matirin, the Ramah brings the ones who argue that the goy could even take it out of your home on Shabbat. If he had his own room that you gave him and said, okay, you're buying this material from me, this is the shed or the room that's going to be designated for your items in my house, and he has it there. So this way he's not taking it from your home, he's taking it from his home, from his room that has been designated to him. So the Ramah says that is something that some rely on, but the Ramah himself is machmir. At the end he says, v'yesh lachmir, you should not rely on these leniencies. Fine. So that is our first sa'if of Shulchan Aruch, and the Mishna Berura deals with the technicality of what's the problem of soaking the dry capsules of dye that they used to have, right? They're going to put it, you soak it, and then it becomes liquidy, and it becomes dye afterwards. So says the Mishna Berura, that is asur mishum megabel. It's like making something that's watery mixed with like cement, and making something that's thicker. The consistency is thicker. That is the isur of mikabel. So therefore, you have to be mindful and careful with that as well. This is like the Gemara, this is sugya in Masachet Shabbat Daf Yud Chet that discusses this. Sheme'arev hadiyo v'hamayim yachad. You're mixing the solid dio with water, and now they are getting mixed to a thicker liquid. And there are those who hold, as we mentioned when we read Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam holds that making en hatzeva is asur deoraita, and therefore that is sovea. Afilu achi, כיוון שמתחיל בזמן המותר בערב שבת, וממילא נגמר הפעולה בשבת, שרי, starting it from before Shabbat, not doing anything, literally anything on Shabbat, that would be מותר. וכן בכל הני דקה חשיב, יש בהן איסור דאורייתא, כשעושה אותם בשבת. All these things, examples that Shulchan Aruch gave, if you would be doing them on Shabbat yourself, would be איסור דאורייתא, and even with all of that, still would be mutar once you start them before Shabbat and you're not doing anything on Shabbat. Now, this that stirring the pot will be a problem. It says not exactly the same as stirring the pot of dye, of paint, when you are trying to dye wool. It's not the same as when you have a pot of food that you're stirring. Because by food, as we mentioned, if it's fully cooked, there's no problem of stirring the pot. Everything is cooked. You can't cook it more. Even if it's mistamek v'yafelo, even if the further cooking is good for the quality, but it's fully cooked right now, it's fine. But in a pot of dye, it will be asur in any case. Even if the bundles of semer have been there for a while, still is asur to stir the pot. We'll be discussing this later on. Therefore, you cannot possibly put bundles of wool inside the dye right before Shabbat unless you are going to seal that pot in a way that you cannot even touch it on Shabbat. Right? So that's the that's the halacha. But if you seal it, then it's mutar, because you're not doing anything on Shabbat, and we don't have a concern of by mistake you forgetting and opening the lid and starting to stir. So says the Gemara, says the Mishna Berura, ve'ilu, after yesh shahud liklot haseva mibod yom, it will be, if you're not sealing it, it will be asur, even though that there is enough time before Shabbat hits on Friday afternoon for the tseva, for the dye to be absorbed by the bundles of wool, still would be asur, because maybe you're going to come to stir the pot afterwards. So therefore you have to certainly seal it, and then it will be mutar. Chayav mishul mebashel, dal yidei agasa b'ktara rotachat mitkarev habishul bimera. If you have food that's not fully cooked and you stir the pot, it will be further cooked, and that is a problem. The traps of fish and so on that we spoke about, if you do that on Shabbat, then you'll be chayav because of Seder. One of the lametet melachot, the 39 prohibited acts on Shabbat is the trapping, right? Seder is one of the lametet melachot. So if you would be throwing a mesuda, throwing a net, and fish will right away be catched as you throw it, then it would be a Isur Torah of Seder. Fine. Says the Mishna Berura. Now again, of course you have to notice that setting up timers nowadays is very much similar to this. You're setting it up from before Shabbat, and now it works on Shabbat. You're setting up that the lights should go off at a certain time on Friday night and come back on Shabbat morning, right? So that is from before Shabbat. It will be mutar, right? Now, can you change the timer's setup on Shabbat? Is a very questionable item. Chacham Ovadia holds that if you are extending the status quo, the tzorech mitzvah is mutar. You have to have two requirements. You're extending. For instance, the lights are supposed to go off at 10 p.m. and you get into a very geschmack sugya. You're learning Siman Bet, and it's amazing, and you want to extend it. You don't want it to be dark. I want to learn until midnight. You're feeling good, so that's Sorach Mitzvah. You want to do Limud Torah. You want to learn, and you are also not changing the status quo. You want to just push 2 more or 3 more of those pieces on the timer to extend it. That's mutar, says Chacham Ovadia. But that's, of course, only with the timers that you have, these metagim that you push in and pull out, but they're attached. But if you have one of those old timers that they had the pin, they took the pin completely out and you placed it somewhere else, those are not so simple, because once you take the pin out, right, was supposed to go off, for instance, with the red pin at 10 p.m., right? And then come back on at 8 a.m., right? So now that you took the pin off, what's this status? Status is now it's not going to go off anymore, right? At this moment that I took the red pin off, now it's going to be, the timer's just going to go on all the way until Shabbat afternoon. Now, when I place it back at 12 midnight, I just changed the status quo of this timer, which will be problematic, right? So you're not talking about that type of timer. You have to also know your timers. But Ovadia says, if you don't have to deal with that, you're just extending the status quo for Sorech Mitzvah, that would be mutar push comes to shove. There are others who disagree with Chacham Ovadia on that, but that's when you're tampering with the timer on Shabbat. If you set up timer from before Shabbat, that would be fine. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein comes along, and this is what I love about Rav Moshe Feinstein, the foresight of seeing the future was a tremendous thing by him. He writes, he's very unhappy about using timers, very unhappy. And he says, look, unfortunately, this whole thing of lights, putting on lights on timer, already has become a thing. I says, don't use timers for anything else. Why? So Moshe Feinstein, because if you start using timers, then everything, every melacha, people are going to be doing everything. Just give it a few decades, and everything would be able to be put on timer. And then you have no Shabbat. People are going to be planning everything. Now, if you think foresight of what's coming on right now, of smart homes and robots and so on and so forth, that's, autonomous cars and so on and so forth, that is exactly what he was referring to, which I believe it will be the destruction of our nation and our communities if you want to rely on everything that technically speaking will be mutar, unless, again, we argue that these are not respect of Shabbat because of uvdin dechol or ziluta de Shabbata, zilzul Shabbat, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, Moshe Feinstein was very fire and brimstone against the usage of timers. He found other issues halachically with them as well. It's for a different time, but simply putting a light and timer from before Shabbat would be fine, and no issues of melacha there. Now, it says the Mishna Berura, this that you could sell something to the goy so long as he exits your house before Shabbat, רוצה לומר, דאי אין שהות לזה, או שאינו יהודי מתנה עמו שיקח ממנו בשבת, אף המכירה אסור. That if the goy says, I'm going to come back in an hour and take it out, you can't sell it to him. It's asur to sell it to him even, right? If you know that there is not going to be enough time for the goy to get out of your domain before Shabbat, you cannot sell to the goy to begin with. Fine, so that is basically what we needed to know in Seif Aleph. Maran writes, continuing in Seif Bet, Umutar liten begadav lechobes enu Yehudi ve'orot lavdan. Can you give your garments to dry cleaner right before Shabbat? You know they're going to be cleaning it on Shabbat, right? Is it mutar or not? Says Shulchan Aruch, mutar liten megadav lekoves. You could give your clothing to a washer, but back then it was just washing. Nowadays the equivalent would be not just laundry, but the dry cleaners. You could do that. Orot lavdan, if you're processing leather, skin of animal, also would be mutar to give it to them right before Shabbat, and they're going to be processing it on Shabbat, even though that you're giving it samuch lechashecha, im katzas lo damim o shoseh otam b'tovat hara. If provided that the price is set. No, again, nowadays the price is pretty set for the dry cleaners, and they're not doing you a favor. They are charging, and that would be mutar. So long as you don't tell them, well, I'm Motzei Shabbat, I need to pick this up, do it on Shabbat quickly, that would be, of course, asur. But if there's enough time, you're coming to Sunday afternoon to pick it up, there's plenty of time for them to do it on a time that's not Shabbat, then it will be mutar. And of course, the goy is going to be doing the job in his domain, in his house, and not in the domain of the Jew, and that would be mutar, as we have discussed this in previous simanim. And says the Mishna Berura, this is the Ramah rather, Haga, ve'im lo katzas asur. If you don't have a set price with him, then it's asur to do it to give it right before Shabbat. And we already discussed that there are those who disagree that if the goy is doing it bechinam, doing it for free, that would be asur. But we already mentioned before in the previous simanim, in Siman Resh Mem Zayin, that would be also allowed. So says the Chafetz Chaim, says the Mishna Berura, v'hu adin l'sh'arei melachot. Same would be with other jobs as well, not just with giving your laundry, your dry cleaning to the dry cleaners, but would be about other melachot as well. And the reason is because you have a set price. He does it when he wants to do it. You don't tell him to do it on Shabbat. He's not doing it in your domain. And as we discussed this in previous simanim, that would be mutar. That's all the criteria that you need for a heter in that scenario. Says the Chafetz Chaim, u'ba'ainan sheyotzihem gam ke mipetach beto mib'od yom. We need you to give it to him on Erev Shabbat, Samuch L'Cheshecha, and he's taking it out of your domain. He's coming to pick up your laundry, your dirty laundry, to do dry cleaning. He has to take it out of your house before Shabbat. Tovat hara'ah, hainu shenitrasa hainu Yehudi la'asid lo b'chinam. He's doing it free for you. And we assume, as we discussed this in Resh Mem Zayin, that we assume that the Jew has done a favor for this individual prior, and now he's trying to pay back to him, or he's expecting something from him in near future, and that's why he is setting the ground for that, and therefore that's not considered a problem, because still the Gentile is adata denafshek havit. Halachically speaking, is considered that he's making the decision to work on Shabbat when he is doing so, not necessarily that he's doing it because you want him to, or you have mentioned or hinted to. He's doing it completely on his own, and that is fine. Now, if you tell the goy, the dry cleaner, says, I'm giving this to you 5 minutes to Shabbat, and please be mindful, you're leaving on Saturday night, so I have to pick them up, right before you close at 7 o'clock, whatever it is, 8 o'clock, right after Shabbat. In that case, if you're traveling Motzei Shabbat, right? That's also equivalent and tantamount to telling him to do it on Shabbat. That would be a problem, of course. Now, we discussed this earlier on, and we had this in the Smicha program in Siman Shin Zayin as well, that if the Magen Avraham writes that if you give a goy money on Erev Shabbat in order to buy for you certain things on Shabbat, if the Yom HaShuk, if the only time the market is open is on Shabbat, then it will be a problem, because it's equivalent to you telling him to buy on Shabbat, because you know that you could only buy this item on Shabbat. So here would be tantamount to that, because you're only giving him an option to work on it on Shabbat. You're giving it to him 5 minutes before Shabbat, you're picking it up 5 minutes after Shabbat. Then, of course, it would be a problem. Now, Rabbi Shaul actually had a tshuva about giving your car into the mechanic shop before Shabbat. And he writes that if you're doing it in such a way that he will be forced to work on Shabbat, it will be asur. But Haravadia Yechavedat writes a tshuva not like that. That even in such case, you'll have still room to be mekel. He brings the Minchat Kohen, that at the end of the day, Maran Bet Yosef holds like the Ran, that if you did not tell him explicitly to buy it on Shabbat or to work on Shabbat, even though that he doesn't have necessarily enough opportunity and time to do it outside of the boundaries of Shabbat hours, within the boundaries of your time limitation, still will be mutar according to the Ran. And says Chacham we paskin like Minchat Kohen, that in this case it will be meikar adin mutar. Again, you have to be cognizant and mindful of the fact that this is machloket poskim, even within the Sephardi poskim, and therefore you should be machmir if possible. But halachically speaking, this is a isur d'Rabbanan of amira lakum, and in the Rabbanan says Chacham Ovadia helech achar mekel, we follow the more lenient shita, and this is agreed upon by many of the Sephardi luminaries of halacha, Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, the Abedin of Algeria, and many who followed his rulings as well. I think the Ben Ish Chai himself is mekel also. Ish Chai wrote a sefer when he was very young, a thin sefer called Rav Brachot. He published it, I think the first publication that he had. The first tshuva there is about the etrog that belonged to a bunch of orphans, was the only kasher etrog in Baghdad for that year. And the question came to his father. This is when the Ben Ish Chai was 16 years old. Lel Sukkot, night of Sukkah, after Suda or after Tefillah rather, they come to him and says, this is the only kasher etrog that we have got. And the father of the household that this etrog is from passed away this past year, and one of the children is not bar mitzvah yet. So they inherited this etrog tree, right? Now one of the owners is a minor. A minor cannot gift you anything, right? Is that kasher or pasul? Veshchai stayed up the whole night. They came in the morning, his father and others came in the morning, they saw he is still raccoon. He's sitting with hundreds of Sfarim open, dozens of Sfarim in front of him, piles and piles of things that he's checking. And he came out with a psak, which later on he wrote, and it's published as the first tshuva there in Sefer Rab Brachot. But be that as it may, in Rab Brachot, I believe he has a tshuva that he also paskins like Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, like the Matei Yehuda and Bet Yehuda, in this case, that he is more mekel. Now, so what comes out, la halacha, in the case of the car, I would have to check this again, but I believe at the end, Haravadia and his son, Rabbi Tzchak Yosef, and Yaakov Yosef, they both write that if push comes to shove, you have what to rely on. In the case of the car, if you're dropping it off in the shop right before Shabbat and picking it up right after, the push comes to shove, you have what to rely on based on all the poskim that we just mentioned right now. But the chatchila, a person should not rely on that. When you don't have to, when you're not pushed. That basically concludes our seif over here, and Be'ezrat Hashem we will continue on seif Gimal in the days to come. Hazak u'Baruch. You got to stop it.